My name is Dr. Charmaine Barnes, and I'm Pro-Vice Chancellor Dean at the University of West London. And I have the very great honour on behalf of Council of chairing the Anti-Racism Advisory Group, as we used to be called, and now it is the Race Equity Group. And part of the work that we have done over the past 2 years in particular was to formulate the Race Equity Month. And today it is with great pleasure that I will be handing over to three speakers who are very passionate about the subject and who've got a lot of research and experience with it, but I'll come to that in a second. You are, just for clarity, you are on the webinar where we are exploring the degree awarding gap. What we encouraging people to do is to use the chat for question and answers. There won't be time for questions in between speakers, but there will be room for questions at the end when they have finished speaking. So I want to start with Naomi Abesikara, who is a policy advisor at Universities UK, helping to develop informed policy solutions to the complex issues facing the higher education sector on behalf of 142 universities across the UK. She has worked across a number of key policy areas at UK, currently focusing on university admissions, access and participation, and the wider student experience. Prior to joining Universities UK, Naomi worked for a charity to reduce barriers to academia for BAME students and staff. I'm going to introduce all three speakers before I hand over to Naomi. We have Beverly Brathwaite, who's a registered adult nurse, a senior fellow with the Higher Education Academy, nearing completion of her PhD, and a senior lecturer at the University of Roehampton in nursing. Beverly's teaching focus has ranged from tissue viability to acute and long-term nursing care, evidence-based practice to inequalities in health and diversity. She has written and spoken widely on diversity and cultural awareness in nursing practice, on Black British nurses' professional experiences, and the awarding gap of Black and brown student nurses and racism in nursing. And last but certainly not least is Rosemary Gottbold, who's a registered nurse and academic working at the University of Hertfordshire. Her expertise is primarily in ethics and decision-making in healthcare, including research ethics and values-based decision-making. Rosemary is passionate about equitable access to education for all health and social care professionals, and much of her research has focused on ethics education and student/learner experience across health and social care programs. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Naomi. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Charmaine, for that introduction. I'm just going to get my slides up. So today I'm going to speak about the work that Universities UK has done in this space to date. So if we just go over to the next slide, please. So we produced two major reports on the topic of the ethnicity degree awarding gap. The first of which was published in 2019 in partnership with the National Union of Students, the NUS. And at that point, we described the awarding gap as the attainment gap, though we've now moved to describing it as an awarding gap to reflect the kind of institutional and societal issues that contribute to degree awards. So that's the language I'll be using for the rest of the presentation. And that first report was comprehensive in kind of setting out the context of the topic, and was one of the first reports of its kind looking at ethnicity awarding gaps in higher education, exploring the existence of the awarding gap between BAME and white students, as well as creating a framework for universities to remove their own awarding gaps, which over 100 institutions signed up to. The next report, which kind of had the small interlude of the pandemic, was published 3 years on in 2022. And that explored the progress that had been made since the first report's publication, and also was designed to kind of help universities build on progress that had been made since 2019, as well as to consider how to drive change in areas where the sector was still experiencing particular barriers or ongoing challenges using the more up-to-date data. And then if we just move on to the next slide, I think it's important to kind of consider the original context that we had in 2019 for this work. So there had been a lot of work in the sector to kind of increase access and participation to higher education, and that was showing in increasing numbers of BAME students attending university. But there remained a great gulf in the success and outcomes once those students arrived at university. So the degree awarding gap is defined as the gap between the likelihood of white students and students from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds to gain a first or upper second class degree. And in the academic year 2017-18, so just before we started work on this report, that gap was set 13.2%, rising to 23.4% for Black students. And we found that that gap existed across the sector. So more than 2/3 of institutions had an awarding gap above 10%. White students were found to outperform students of all other ethnicities, even when prior attainment was controlled for. So that's the graph that you can see on the right there, where you can see that white students outperform students of other ethnicities regardless of entry grades. So put together, evidence from the Office for Students focusing on English institutions shows that once other factors are accounted for, so prior attainment, gender, age, there remained an unexplained difference between white and Black students of 17%. And if we move on to the next slide, that those problems kind of fed through into the rest of the academic pipeline as well. So in 2017-18, 16% of academic staff, but just 10% of professors identified as BAME, and only 0.6% of professors were Black. And if you look at the rather depressing graph on the right there, this is professors by sex and ethnicity between 2015 and 2020. You can see there hasn't been a huge amount of change over that time period, but in particular, that very minuscule red line right at the bottom represents BAME female professors. So that shows the kind of issues of intersectionality in this space as well. So that was the challenging context that we were working with, and that the report gathered together and brought to light. But we were really keen to make this report solutions focused as well. So if we just move on to the next slide, we developed this report, as I said, in collaboration with the NUS, and that meant that we could consult across our two memberships. So we consulted with students, staff in universities, as well as vice chancellors. And between June and December 2018, we sent out calls for evidence, held regional roundtable evidence sessions with over 160 participants, and worked with a vice chancellor working group. So overall, 99 universities and student unions contributed to this report, which enabled us to develop a really kind of representative set of recommendations that universities could practically use in order to close their awarding gaps. And we termed these 5 steps to success, which I'll just kind of go through now. So the first one is on providing strong leadership. So university leaders need to demonstrate a commitment to removing the awarding gap and also lead by example themselves. The second one is about having conversations about race. So universities and students need to create more opportunities to talk about race, racism, and the awarding gap, and explore what students think is causing it. So a changes culture is needed alongside that strong institutional message that issues of race are embedded within wider strategic goals. Thirdly, need to develop racially diverse and inclusive environments. So as some of those statistics I outlined earlier show, university leadership teams are not representative of the student body, and some curriculums don't necessarily reflect the experiences of minority groups, and that can really impact the sense of belonging that BAME students feel when they're at university. So more emphasis is needed to cultivate a sense of belonging that we know is so important for student success and progression to postgraduate study as well. Number 4 is getting the evidence and analysing the data. So we recommended that institutions need to take a more kind of scientific approach by gathering and scrutinising the data that they have in a more comprehensive way in order to inform discussions. And number 5 is understanding what works, ensuring that universities can work together using applied research to share high quality evidence of what works as well as what doesn't, to ensure an evidence-based approach to any interventions. And then if we move on to the next slide, this moves into the second report, which was 3 years on. And there were some signs of progress when we kind of looked back at and reran the same kind of analysis. There were signs of progress. So the sector level ethnicity awarding gap had reduced by 4.4% in the academic year 2020-2021 compared to 2017-18. And at a provider level, 95 of the 131 providers that had comparable data had reduced their gaps. It's worth bearing in mind that this was during the pandemic. The 2020-2021 year was slightly skewed by certain COVID assessment measures, so it might be interesting to reflect on how those findings might be different now that many universities have gone back to previous methods of assessment. But things weren't necessarily all positive. So the gap between Black and white students getting first-class degrees had increased from 16.9% in 2017-18 to 19.3% 3 years later. And there were also 40 providers whose awarding gap had stayed the same or actually got worse. So if we move on to the next slide, we thought it was important to then reflect on the successes, what had worked well in driving some of that progress, but also what was still needed to tackle the areas where there hadn't been as much progress. So we again consulted widely with many stakeholders, and they all told us that those 5 steps to success originally identified in the 2019 report still felt like a really relevant framework for driving a reduction in the ethnicity degree awarding gap. And I would say this, but I both reports, I think, are still really relevant, valuable resources. So I'd encourage any of you to download those from our website and digest the messages they have, but they also have a lot of really practical tips that you can instate in your own institutions. So, you know, those 5 steps to success definitely still remain. But in addition to that, we considered how to drive forward further action from these commitments. And in terms of what was needed next, we came up with these 3 steps. The first of which is to prioritise genuine co-production with students. So jointly developing and implementing a strategic whole university approach to removing the gap. Number 2 is to embed institutional approaches to removing degree awarding gaps, ensuring there is accountability for all staff within every academic faculty and every professional services department. And number 3 is to develop evaluation expertise. So since the original report, the existence of TASO, which is the Higher Education What Works Evidence Centre, is really crucial in terms of gathering the data and understanding what works, but it's also up to individual institutions to build an understanding of what success looks like in their own context and how that can be maintained. And then if we just go to the final slide, that's it from my side in the work that we've been doing at Universities UK at a sector-wide level, but I look forward to the further presentations on the health-specific context and discussion later.
Thank you so much, Naomi. That was succinct but very informative, and at the end, when you've finished your presentations, I'll just do a highlight summary from what I've picked up before we move on to questions and answers. So let's hand over to both Bev and Rosemary, who are going to take us through to the second part of this webinar.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rosemary.
Oh, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Beverly. So I'm going to start off talking about why we did it and what sort of started the process off. And then Rosemary's going to talk about the changes that have occurred at the University of Hertfordshire, which I no longer work at. So she's going to focus on that, and then we'll come back to some of the key points that we found in regards to the work that was done. So if we can move the next slide there. Oh yeah, so actually I should have said that. So the article we wrote in 2000, it was published, thank you, it was published in 2021, and we submitted it in 2020, and I asked Rosemary, Dr. Rosemary, nobody said that so far, if she would like to join me with looking at this area. They did do a lot of work around it at U Hertfordshire, so I think it was a seminar or something that they were going around the whole of the university talking about the awarding gap, which sort of highlighted it to me, which I felt a bit bad about as a Black woman, not really appreciating that that was a thing. I mean, obviously it is definitely a thing. So I started looking into it and started doing some work in my department, and then I wanted to write something. So I asked Rosemary to assist with me. Do you want to move to the next slide there, Rosemary? So it's quite interesting to hear what the previous speaker has been talking about, because it pretty much resonates with what we found and what we've written. This is something quite up to date. It was an article in the British Journal of Nursing that did a literature review looking at areas around specifically nursing and specifically the awarding gap. And our article was part of that literature review. And it's just an interesting way that we thought we could start off with, giving the key points that now in 2023, where we are. And as I said, the previous speaker has sort of stolen our thunder a bit there, because a lot of things that she found, that they found in those 2 reports, I think we referenced the first one, is really important. So the key points is, first, I think, nursing is different. Every area is different, but I think nursing is different because in regards to the issue of clinical practice and in regards to the academic side, and both having an issue in regards to the nicest way of saying it is unconscious bias, and the more overt ways it's talking about institutional racism in both education and in the National Health Service and in nursing. So nurse education has a responsibility to understand the impact of racism on health, which sounds ridiculous really, to not appreciate how that racism exists and how it actually works. But you'd be very surprised, some of you would possibly be very surprised in that some of the basic understanding of exactly what racism is and exactly how racism works, a lot of people of a variety of ethnicities don't really understand what racism is and how racism works, and that makes it really difficult to be able to acknowledge or do something about it. We are in a unique position to change the social determinants of health. That was a key point that we came up in our article with regards to in nursing and how it impacts on the society and how unequal outcomes can be for different ethnicities. And I suppose the biggest one at the moment that people are talking about is if you're a Black or a brown woman, you're more inclined, more likely to die of childbirth than your white counterpart. Schools and departments of nursing should form equality, diversity, inclusion committees. And I think that's important, but it needs to be a committee that has teeth and that can actually do something and report to the systems and processes within the organisation. Otherwise, it's a waste of time. And then finally, institutions need to commit to addressing issues of retaining Black students and staff to ensure robust reporting systems are in place to provide effective anti-racist training to staff and students. And again, the young lady previously talked about the issue about institution and ensuring robust reporting systems and collecting data. And now that we could argue that, well, we could go into the fact that can be quite a difficult area to try and get the data, because there's the issue of GDPR, and then people's interpretation of GDPR in regards to data and ethnicity can be interpreted in very interesting ways that make it a bit more difficult to do that. And the issue around training and how effective training can be when it comes to racism and unconscious bias, the evidence around how effective training can be is contentious, I think, I'll say, to say the least. But with further ado, I shall leave my bit and take it away, Rosemary.
Thanks, Bev. So in the School of Health and Social Work at the University of Hertfordshire, we did have an awarding gap that was above the sector average. It is a bit of a good news story in that since then, across the school, the awarding gap has been reduced by 50%. Just to note, as Naomi did, that this was coincided with student support strategies that were implemented during the pandemic. And we have done some reflection on that in terms of what was working and continuing some of those approaches. The awarding gap strategy in our school aligns with the University's UK guidance, and just going to talk a bit more in each of these areas about what we have done and how we've managed to halve the awarding gap. So we have got a strategic group that meets, and we've had very strong leadership in this area, not just within our school, but also across the university. A big focus has been on conversations about race, terminology, the terminology we should use institution-wide, and also having training available to staff about having conversations with colleagues and students about terminology. There is HR strategy in place, and training and funding has gone into this area. We've talked a bit about data analysis. Part of the awarding gap strategy group's remit was to interrogate the data And we started at undergraduate level, and we have gradually gone up the academic levels, and we've also examined master's level, taught master's level data. The data is slightly more elusive at doctoral level, but we are making gains with that as well. And then having done the data analysis, taking direct action, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So we have full student involvement with, we had funded student representation, who were the bridge between the university as an institution and the student voice. They have a voice on our committees, and we've also encouraged them to be co-researchers with us. We've also got a very well-developed programme of personal tutors, and we've continued a lot of the student support that was put in place during the pandemic. In terms of the curriculum, which is something Bev and I really highlighted in our article, very practical things that can be done in order to decolonise the curriculum. For example, changing set texts, having expert external lecturers, experts by experience and simulation, which reflects our diverse student cohorts. We've also initiated audits of module sites. So Canvas is our learning platform, and we have guidance on how to make those module sites representative, and audits are carried out on those to ensure that that happens. In terms of it being something of a good news story, there's still a lot of work to be done, and keeping the momentum moving forward. The ambitious target for our school is to reduce the awarding gap to 6% by the end of 2025. And in order to do this is to continue facilitating and valuing student perspectives. We know that practice placement area is a particularly problematic area across our health and social work programs, and work is underway across programs. We've recently initiated a project with Black and minority ethnic adult nursing students, and it's co-participation project. Institutional support, for example, funding continues, so that's been really great. And HR policies and proactive recruitment strategies in order to address some of the issues around disparities in staffing and diversity in our that reflects our student body. Continuation of data analysis across all levels of higher education, not just focused on undergraduate. I've talked a bit about co-participation in research, and a constant reframing as well. So switching, Naomi talked about switching from the attainment to the awarding gap, removing the onus of responsibility from the student onto the institution. And continually striving to do that. So, for example, a recent paper published in Nursing Education said that students should be equipped with how to deal with racism when they go out into placement. And obviously that's important, but I think what's more important is that we tackle the issue of racism head on. And we are working across our programs to find strategies that we can use to enhance the student experience when they go out into placement. We have slightly changed the focus of our awarding gap strategy group, which I think reflects perhaps the gains that were made, but also a commitment to keep moving forward in terms of promoting racial equality in learning, we're now called. So that is what we've done in the School of Health and Social Work at the University of Hertfordshire.
Thank you, Rosemary.
Over to you.
Yeah, just to close, we've taken a quote from our article. I can't remember who wrote this, but anyway, it's our article, so it was written. And it basically just summarizes the key things that the previous speaker and Rosemary and I have been talking about in regards to that, that strong leadership and commitment to cultural, institutional, social change, meaningful individual reflection on your own personal biases and its impact on our educational practices, harnessing and evaluating teaching and assessment methods which promote inclusivity and value Black and brown students' voices. And it's a lovely, solid, good statement, but just very briefly to break it down. I think the most important thing in this is strong leadership, and that's institutional leadership, and that's so that what you want is your Pro-Vice Chancellor to really understand that this needs to be addressed, and it comes, arguably actually comes from top down with regards to the support and the leadership in regards to that, and really valuing that it takes time to do something like this, and then it isn't a one-off, just let's do something for it this year or next year. It is something that should be embedded into the systems and processes of an institution, that this area is important and that you have designated people doing the work and be consistent about that. Without strong leadership, it's not going to work. Without a complete and total understanding of particularly racism and how it works both institutionally and individually to impact on how assessment is done, or how from what happens in the classroom to how marking is done, to impact on the awarding gap. If that isn't considered as something that is constantly needing to be checked and supported to maintain equity, then the significant change that needs to be done to reduce the awarding gap will not happen. Thank you very much. That's us.
I would just like to conclude as well by just thanking the Council of Deans for asking us to talk today. Oh, yes. It has given us, Bev and I, the opportunity to reflect on what's happened over the last 3 years since we wrote this article. It did come from a space where we were both very passionate. Both of us had various different experiences, which provided a catalyst as well as the awarding gap. And we've been very grateful of the opportunity to just reflect on the progress that's been made, but also to think carefully about how we need to continue to move forward for the future of our students. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all our three speakers. And before, we've had 3 questions in the chat so far, and I'm hoping, we'll have a few more. But just to summarize what I've heard so far. And so with Naomi, Naomi talked about the Black, Asian and minority student attainment at Universities UK, the report that you have done. And there was 2 reports, and one was closing the ethnicity degree awarding gaps, which was a follow-on 3 years on. This is pan, United Kingdom level. So that's really interesting because we've got speakers who are talking about something that comes from across the UK, but we've also got speakers talking about what they have done within a university, within a faculty. I think what we mustn't lose sight of, there were very interesting nuggets in there that are transferable to any work that you might be doing locally. I think that's something to remember. I thought it was very interesting, well, it's uncomfortable, that there is an explained difference between white and black students of 17%. You know, I think that's what Naomi's slide came to, the first slide came to that conclusion. And that has fed into the academic pipeline with BAME female professors facing the worst outcome. And you know, that is a given. My own research shows that's where we are with that one. While the gap has reduced during the pandemic, it is a bit difficult to ascertain the impact of the emergency regs on those current figures. And I suspect what each of us on this call will find, that that awarding gap is not looking as rosy as it probably did when the emergency regulations were in play. I loved the 5 steps, and we've all seen the report previously, the 5 steps to success, and that still holds true even today. And there are recommendations for 3 years on, which I thought were 3 steps which focuses on a whole institutional approach, which I think is really important for those of us who are on this call that perhaps work at institutional level. I think there is a very clear message coming out there that whatever you do locally does need to be replicated at institutional level to make an impact. I got the message that there has to be a co-production with students because it concerns students, and that's really important. And I think the accountability, so whilst you're holding the institution to account, there is an individual academic and professional services accountability there too. And I loved the idea of the evaluation strategies, because sometimes that's where we come unstuck. We do a lot of work and we forget to measure impact, so we can't tell the story as it evolves. So thank you, Naomi, for that. And then we had what I would call you know, development on this very topic, but at the University of Hertfordshire. So in a university, within a faculty, but certainly you can see everything that you talked about, Rosemary and Bev, that is certainly being transferred across your university and is certainly transferable across to other universities. So thank you. And yours was by looking at the awarding gap in pre-reg adult nursing students. And what you were really looking at was developing an anti-racist nursing education, but that education was not just, pardon me, confined to the curriculum. You were talking about strategies that went beyond that. And for me, you developed an awarding gap strategy through an institutional strategy, which I think is really important in all these conversations. You looked at the curriculum, and you looked at decolonizing the curriculum. You looked at data analysis, which I think again goes with the evaluation strategy, is really important and very fundamental. You looked at anything you did being co-produced with the people affected who were your students. I loved your ambitious, really, really genuinely loved the ambition to decrease the awarding gap to 6% in 2025. And I'm hoping, Rosemary, I will be there to enjoy that success with you, because that is phenomenal. That is a very robust percentage. And it sounds like you're on your way there. And plans to keep moving forward. And I think the 2 concluding statements from both Bev and Rosemary were saying it does include strong leadership. And I truly do agree with this based on experience. It includes, for the individual academic, it includes keeping an eye of equitable assessment practices. I think that's really important. And you basically were telling us to pay close attention to our own individual personal biases that tend to resurrect themselves from time to time. So I'm hoping that I've captured for the audience a summary of where we were at a UK and a local level. And on that further note, unless my three speakers have got anything to say at this point, I'm happy to hand over to our audience. Is that okay? And I will direct them to an individual. So yes, okay. The first one is, hi, Naomi. Do you have any examples of genuine co-production with students and how best to work with students to address the gap? But of course, by then they hadn't heard Bev and Rosemary's, presentation. But Naomi, I'm happy for you to go with that first.
Yeah, I mean, I think Rosemary spoke about a really valuable example at the University of Hertfordshire, so perhaps she's best placed to speak to that one. But I think what our second report focused on was developing working groups across whole institutions, so at different levels within academic faculties, but also within the student body. And I think key to that student engagement is also ensuring equity of representation. So I think Rosemary spoke about having students as co-researchers on board that are also paid for their time. So I think those are kind of key for across different institutions, but perhaps Rosemary might want to speak on the specific example at Hertfordshire.
Rosemary, anything you want to add to that at this point?
Yeah, sure. We have an example of a student rep within our doctoral student body, and that student has a particular methods for communicating with Black and minority ethnic students, and they will bring certain concerns, and then those can be elevated through her to the people that run those programs, but also doctoral college. And that has been a really, really effective way to give our students, doctoral students, a voice. So that's another example, along with the co-participation with our students as researchers with us.
So I think what I heard there was, it's something that's quite simple. Have a named person that is involved with your specific strategies, and make sure that everyone concerned knows who that named person is, so that matters can get escalated, and equally messages can go down the line too, because sometimes we raise upwards and then sometimes we forget to tell the original person who brought it up what we've actually done about it. So we sell ourselves short and cause a lot of undue anxiety. Thank you very much. Now, the second one, I think this is still addressed to you, Naomi, since it says your work sounds really great. Thank you very much, whoever the anonymous attendee is. Do you have any advice, but I think it could apply to any of you now. Do you have any advice on how our health faculty may be able to implement some of these ideas, but also how to really engage and get buy-in from leadership, which is something we're really struggling with? And if all three of you can't answer this, I'll be able to answer it quite well. But there you go for it. I can. Let's go for it.
Okay. If in your organization there isn't really there's a strategy, because there will always be some kind of EDI strategy in any university, any higher education. There will always be a strategy. First of all, you have to know what that strategy is, so that you can see how that you can possibly feed into that strategy and identify what in that strategy you think that in your area, in your faculty particularly, is relevant. Of course, the whole thing should be, but there could be specific things that you think, well, I think we could, if we did this, this, and this, that would be really helpful in regards to meeting that strategy. I think if you cannot relate it to something that is the focus of the whole of the university, getting buy-in from senior teams is practically impossible. Just saying that it's, racism exists and we need to sort out the awarding gap, I absolutely agree with you. But that you're not going to get buy-in with that, because if there was buy-in with just that, none of us would be here right now if that was the thing. So I think the best thing is that whatever the EDI strategy of your university is, do you know what it looks like? And when they say what they're going to do, then you can question and say, well, you've got this in your EDI strategy. What's happening in regards to that? Because I'd like to be involved, but I don't know what you're doing. You've said this in your EDI strategy. I don't understand. Well, what are you doing? Or this is what we could do in this department or this faculty, and I'm happy to assist with that. Now, of course, there's the issue of, with all what you have to do you want to do that? And that is a personal thing after that in regards to if you want to do that. And then hopefully, if you do get the buy-in, then the financial support and the time, because what I think happens a lot is that the amount of time and work it takes to get these things to be moving through, that's the battle that you have, really, is identifying that your workload would have to that somebody's workload has to change in order to make this really happen. And that's another area with the issues in regards to recruitment and retention and the changing of faculties and finances that proves difficult. So again, if you don't consider it important enough, you won't allocate the time and the funding to your staff. So it's a bit of a cycle there.
Thank you. And I think you've highlighted, I think the key message to answer the question, thank you for that, Bev, is I would say, and this is from a personal perspective, as someone who leads on EDI, I think Bev is absolutely right. Find out what your EDI strategy is and find out who your EDI champion is within your university and get buy-in. Trust me, it's not that difficult. We're all human beings. Yeah, you will get through, but I think leadership is very key if you can tap into the right people. I'm just going to move us on because thank you, Bev. I've got some questions here. I think this one might be a simple one. Is it possible to have sight of your inclusivity audit pro forma? Who is this being directed to? Hertfordshire or Universities UK? Okay, we can come back to that. Rima, perhaps you can just let us know on the chat and we'll come back to it. Or you can just perhaps type in your answer and the relevant person will come back to you. Tracy says, excellent work and well done, Hertfordshire. Yes, very well done, Hertfordshire. How did you go about reviewing your grading criteria, your scales and feedback methods? I'm conscious we've got 12 minutes and a few more questions. So whoever wants to take this one, either Rosemary or Beverly?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. We looked at the grading criteria and we also looked at we have grading rubrics, and both of those were reviewed, and we actually changed our grading criteria. So we moved from a 100% grading criteria to a 19-point grading scale, and that meant that the kind of where student fails were like around the 49 or the 39%, then academics had to actually make more of a jump into, yes, this student has passed, no, this student hasn't passed. So the 19-point grading scale appears to have been quite successful, and we're currently reviewing it for use. Some of our master's programs use it, and we're currently reviewing that across the rest of the school at the moment.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Naomi, I think the next one is for you. And I think it's basically asking you, are you planning to follow on your work from the 3 years on? So I think that's really what the question's about.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think so in terms of UK's work in this space, so we continue to have annual conferences on closing the ethnicity awarding gap. Our next event on that topic is going to be on the 23rd of April. So if you're interested in that topic, I encourage you to come along. And that's kind of our next chance to check in on progress. I think it's probably a little early to do any further follow-up report from the 3 years on, given that it was only published kind of last summer. But you know, in the team working on student experience and access and participation, of course, the awarding gap and ongoing efforts to challenge racism within the higher education sector all fall into that. So yeah, that's kind of where we're at the moment.
Thank you. I'm really pleased about that, Naomi, because it would be such a shame if you didn't do the work at such a pan-UK level, this one might fall between the cracks and only get relegated to universities that are doing something about it, rather than, you know, we've all got competing priorities all the time. So I'm really pleased that that is actually being kept on, you know, your agenda. Thank you. So this is an interesting one. You've done, I think what the question here is about, it's either for Rosemary or Beverly. Hertfordshire, again, you've done work for nursing. I think the question has obviously come from someone who's an AHP. I know that the work is replicable, but are you taking it across the faculty? I know you talked about levels, but I don't know whether across the faculty.
Yeah, so we have a school, it's the School of Health and Social Work, and within that is midwives, physios, paramedics, nurses, midwives, radiographers, therapeutic radiographers. Sorry if I've missed anybody. So our school encompasses allied health professionals as well as nurses, and the strategy is across the whole school. So it's not just in adult nursing, it's across the whole school.
Thank you. I think that's encouraging. I'll be keen to talk to you when I eventually get there, Rosemary, about how are you then transferring it across all your faculties at a subject level. Very, very important topic. So thank you for that. Now, the next two questions, one by Jadine and one by an anonymous attendee, I think are dealing with the same issue. So basically, they're talking about nursing, and there's a lot of other programs in healthcare that share their grading with clinical practice. So for example, nursing is 50-50. It says here that, you know, a clinical practice is graded, well, it's a pass or a fail, but, you know, as necessarily not necessarily every university does a grade for it. But I think the important question being asked here, we're focusing a lot on institutional strategies at higher education level, academic professional services, decolonizing the curriculum, you know, paying attention to equitable assessment practice. And rightly, people are asking, what is happening within clinical practice? Before I hand over the question to, I don't know who wants to take this, is just to say that at Council of Deans with the race equity group, this is going to be the work going forward. Across England, we have heard more and more that there is a whole element there of racism in clinical practice that students are talking about, and it's not necessarily overt racism, it could be classified as microaggression, and being perpetuated maybe between races and students, but also from clinical staff. So naturally, there would be a perception that's going to impede your grade. So I don't know if anyone feels in a position to comment more than what I've said. I'll hand over. Who wants to take this? Yeah, Rosemary, please do.
Yeah, I'm happy to take this, Charmaine, thank you. The situation is that we know that students on a daily basis experience microaggressions, racism, even violence in clinical practice. And I think the narrative where the onus is on the student to be able to cope with those situations is gradually, hopefully, going to change in the same way that the onus for the attainment gap moved to the awarding gap. We know that there are pockets of good practice, but we also know that there is a massive amount to do in this area. It is difficult in that our practice placement partners, we need to work with them to secure placements, but we also need to ensure that the students get the best possible experience they can. So our starting point has been with the students. We want to establish what their experiences are so that we can then move forward with our placement partners and do some work with them around this issue.
Thank you. Bev, did you want to come in on that?
I just wanted to give some background in regards to the issue of practice placements. So in regards to what happens to Black and brown staff in practice placement in the NHS, full stop, you know, there's a plethora of evidence about not getting leadership positions, experiencing racism, and so on in regards to that, and the WRES data about you know, you're less, basically the higher up the band you go, for those who aren't nurses, band 5 is a newly registered nurse and band 9 is a very senior experienced nurse. And then this goes into management speak. That's basically the higher up the grading that you go, the whiter it becomes, and that's particularly the same in South East England, where you know, and London, where like at least 40% in some areas of the staff is Black or brown, but ultimately higher up that you go, the whiter it gets. So just to say that there's not surprisingly that there are practices in regards to assessment that are unequitable, and that unequitableness is based on racism. Some of it's on unconscious bias, but I'd say the majority of that is based on at least racial stereotypes of what an expectation of how Black and brown staff should behave, and their intelligence and what they're capable of. There are still strong, significant racial stereotypes that perpetuate the way that nurses are, Black and brown nurses are mentored, practice supervised and practice assessed in clinical practice. Just want to say that.
Thank you very much. We've got 2 precious minutes left. I can't see, can I see anything else just come in? Oh, yeah. It is good to hear that placement related issues are going to be focused upon moving forwards. I do think that's really important. I do think we've got some issues there that we need to work with our placement providers. It's not a them and us, by the way, because without all of us together in it, we can't actually produce the necessary workforce. Roger says it is important not to conflate microaggression with racism. I've got 1 minute to, if anyone wants to take that.
I got that.
Yeah, please.
Be interesting to know what you mean by conflate, because when it comes to the outcome of what's happened, so whether it's overt racism or racial unconscious bias, the outcome for the person it's being impacted on is the same. It's, like I said, it's an interesting word, what you mean by conflate, because there's a whole debate, and I could be here for days, discussing about unconscious bias, racial unconscious bias, and what actually is the difference between race, whether it's conscious or unconscious, is the outcome and the effect not the same? And that, because you don't know what you're doing is racist, or you don't perceive that what you're doing is racist, is unconscious bias. Does that mean that it means that what happens to the person that's being inflicted on it isn't, the outcome isn't the same, and that unconscious bias isn't part of how institutional racism works as well? So microaggression sounds smaller and less offensive, but consistent microaggressions, there is work to say that it has a physical response on Black and brown people. And so I could question your use of the word conflate. You know, we haven't got time. Sorry.
Yeah. Thank you, because I notice people are leaving because obviously they've got things to do. I want to just end by saying I'm so glad that we had the time. Oh dear, Scylla, is the 19-point scale something you developed, or is it in use already? Could one of the 3 speakers please reply? That would be really useful. It's on the chat. But I want to finish this session by saying thank you so much to Naomi, to Rosemary, and to Beverly. Keep doing the fantastic work that you are doing, because I think it's, you know, through individual and collective championing, we will get ahead of this one, wherever we are. Thank you so much. Don't forget, there is a feedback poll. It's really important that you tell us what you think. And, you know, be well, everybody. And hopefully we will see each other somewhere soon. Take care. Thanks ever so much. Bye-bye.